We've had the pleasure of working with the Catawba Island Historical Society many times over, but the new collaboration that we have we're working on has been one that we're very, very excited about, and we're really happy to welcome them here today, and especially Mr. Thomas, who's going to talk about the history of pleasure boating here on Catawba Island. A chance meeting with Catawba Island historian Don Rhodes in 2014 introduced Rick to colorful stories of Catawba Island, its origins, inhabitants, and its development. In 2017, he was asked to join the board of directors of the Catawba Island Historical Society. And the rest, as they say, is history. So please, if you will, please welcome Mr. Rick Dr.
Thanks, Lisa. You can have that. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Welcome. Before we start, I have to clarify something, all right? Craig Corporal, who's on the board with me, he wrote a beautiful press release for the Beacon, sent it in about 2 weeks ago, and I read it. I approved the press release. I approved the title. It was perfect. So wasn't I surprised about 2 days ago when I looked at the story in the Beacon, and it claimed that I was an expert. Now, that's not what we had at the top of the story. So I want to assure you, I'm not an expert in this topic. I'm with the museum, and more on that in a minute. So this is the way it appeared in the Catawba Boating Expert to Tackle Vintage Craft at CIC. Now, I don't know if that means I'm going to, like a football player, I'm going to tackle a boat, or if I'm going to be talking about pleasure boating in the CIC or about the marina. So this is what it was supposed to say. A short history of pleasure boating around Catawba Island. So it was an enthusiastic journalist that must have changed the title. And then this would also be appropriate, So what I'm asking here is, if you have any questions or corrections, wait till the end. I have a lot to cover. But I'm sure there's some of you that know more than I do about boating, especially sailing. Sailing is a very complex form of boating on the lake, I've learned. It's not just putting the sail up and going in one direction. All right, so I also have a confession to make before we start here. I'm not a boater, and I'm not a history major, okay? So you're not going to get a dusty, dry college history lesson here. You're going to get, what I hope you're going to get is the following: a fast-paced, fun presentation on boating. I hope you're going to get a bunch of interesting historic nuggets, that some of which your guide didn't know that. And most importantly, you're going to get a sneak peek at a new exhibit at our museum, right? It's called Pleasure Boating Around Catawba Island, ironically. And that has just been finished up. It's a 4x6 piece of wood with lots of photos and so forth. So we hope you'll stop by the museum. How many people here know we have a museum? Well, that's good. Yeah. Okay. Well, we do. We have a museum. We are on East Porter, about 2 blocks south of the Miller Ferry Dock and a little bit north of Twin Oaks. We occupy the historic Union Chapel on that street. We have a website, Catawba Island Historical Society.com. We have a Facebook page, which is updated regularly, and we have a YouTube channel. Now, the YouTube channel, if you go there and you type in Catawba Island Historical Society, there are going to be some historic videos on there. We've had speakers come in the past, and this is a grab from a video I did, a tour of the museum a few years ago with Theo's in the back there. Did a great job. He's taping this today, so we hope you'll stop by the museum. I'm going to do a little plug here for the museum before we start. Union Chapel opened in 1888. It was a non-denominational meeting space. It was a Sunday school. And you can see that at that time in history, there wasn't much at the top of the island. Orchards, that's about it. That house on the left there still stands, and that's about it. And then everything was added. But that's looking south. The building sat empty from 1983 till about 2017. It just sat empty, and the township did a great job of taking care of the building. So let's go here to, how many know Don Rhodes or knew Don Rhodes? Don grew up on the island. I met him kind of by accident. I went up to his Ottawa City General Store and walked in there. Nobody was there that day. It was a Wednesday. And I think he had these glasses like this, And he said, "Can I help you?" I said, "Well, I'm new on the island. I love history, and I heard about your store." He said, "Well, you're in the right place." So 2 hours later, I left, being enlightened about Catawba Island history. Don was getting older a few years ago, and he said he used to always famously say, "If you ask a history question, now listen to me," and he grabbed your arm. So he had an idea. He didn't want his all of his precious artifacts and books and so forth to end up in a private collection or at an antique store. So he got together with some people and he floated the idea of a museum. Craig was one of them, and a group of people said, "Yeah, we could do that." So down the road is the chapel, and the township agreed to let us use it, which was a really good fit. So this is where they started. I'll give you a little timeline here. In 2016, the concept was fleshed out. We elected a board of directors. Don was included as founding father, local history guru, and here he is now. Listen to me. If he was really adamant about something, he would grab your arm, say, "Now listen to me. Now look at me," and that's how he'd get your. He was a very good teacher, very good. The township renovated the Union Chapel for us. They did a great job. We named the museum the Catawba Museum at Union Chapel. Ice harvesting exhibit was the first to come, and we earned the National Register of Historic Places designation in 21 with the help of Jeff Brown, who's on the board with us. Went through all that paperwork. And we do these outreach programs to the community to let people know that we have a museum and it continues to grow and develop, and it's a pretty cool place. So here's the township fixing the building up, and their help has been wonderful. We started here. Once it was cleaned up, we ended with this. So my job was to make the space look like a museum. And this was last summer. We invited the Gem Beach folks in for a special showing, and that's what we have now. So it looks a lot like a museum. And right towards the back of that photo is where the pleasure boating display is going to be. So let's go ahead and start. I think this picture might be from Put-in-Bay, I think. So this boating for pleasure, this is an enormous topic I found out as I started researching it. And why is that? Because everyone loves to be on the water, near the water, and a lot of folks want to be on the water in their boats, right? So I thought to myself, how far back in time can we go with the topic of pleasure boating? And that led to a bunch of digging and reading. We know that the prehistoric people in this area and elsewhere made dugout canoes. They would take a log, they would build a linear fire along the top of the log, they'd let it burn for a while, and they'd hack out the charcoal with a tool called an adze, and they'd make these canoes eventually. But did they ever use them for fun is the question. I would argue that human nature doesn't change, so it's very likely that these folks used their canoes at some point for fun, right? And you can find some renderings where, this might actually be the first sailboat. I mean, if you look at the picture, who wouldn't want to be with a topless young woman holding sail up like that? Anyway, so you go forward a few centuries, you have birch bark canoes. The earliest settlers found the natives using these boats. They were lightweight, they were very fast, and they were technically power boats because they would use paddles, but were they used strictly for work is the question. Meet George Catlin. This was an interesting guy. He was an attorney. He spent time with the native peoples. Later in life, he got very interested in them. Great Plains, New York, Michigan, and then he was very close to our area near the Erie Canal. He did hundreds, something like 400 oil paintings of the native people. This one's entitled Lake Erie, so it's likely this was somewhere near us because he was in this area. So you can see all the native folks out there. In there, to me, those look like birch bark canoes, but I can't tell. So anyway, now we have a visual record of native behavior. Now this painting that Catlin did is titled by the author, Canoe Race. And this was done, I read somewhere up by Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, so not too far away. And you can see that we have clearly you have two braves racing each other, standing up with their paddles, and you got the whole tribe in the area cheering them on with rifles and paddles waving in the air and so forth. There's other evidence here. This is a vintage cigarette card entitled Canoe Racing. Same posture, standing up. It reminds me of the young people on the surfboards, that we see nowadays. And this one is from the Harper's Weekly, 1874. William Carey did the drawing, same topic, called Indian Canoe Race. And this is about 100 years going forward, and I'm just pointing out that human nature doesn't change much. So, all right, so back to George. What about sailing? How far back can we go? Well, Catlin did do an oil painting. If you look at this map of Indian tribes and you zero in on Michigan, you can see that there were two tribes, the Sauk and the Fox, that were in southeastern Michigan. We're right about there, so pretty close by. These two tribes coexisted. They were in the late woodland period, about 1000 AD. They spoke the Algonquin language, and they eventually coalesced into one nation, and they still exist out west. So the question is, did they engage in pleasure boating? And according to Catlin, it looks like they did. This painting was done somewhere near where they lived, and I like to think this might be a precursor yacht club and regatta right here, because if you look closely, they're clearly racing these, what look like dugout canoes. I'm not sure about that. And you've got people cheering here. Go. Ichiman is Algonquin for canoe man, I found out. So let's fast forward, late 19th century. This is the outline I'd like to follow. We've got power boats. We'll take a look at sailing, and we'll take a look at rum runners briefly, because rum running was a business. But the rum runners often used highly modified pleasure boats. We'll get into that in a little bit. So I thought it'd be fun to put in there. So here, let's start with power boating. This is now the Dart Company was actually out of Toledo back in the day. So they made some beautiful boats in Toledo, Ohio. I think that's probably the Maumee River. Now, wooden boat construction back in the day, and we're talking big boats, yachts, this sort of thing. The shipwrights would use half-hull models. We have these two at the museum from Don. These are half-hull models from the Port Clinton shipyard around the 1860s. You got the C.B. Benson on the top. You have the Caroline on the bottom. And these were both Lake Erie schooners. The story of the Benson's fascinating, but you have to go to the museum to read it. It's pretty long. But shipwrights, going back to the colonial era here in America, would use these half-hull models. They would do design, shear, proportions, and they could then turn that into working blueprints, right, to make their boats. So that process, very expensive, very time-consuming, and if you made a big boat using that technique, you had to be pretty wealthy. That was typically the people that were building these boats. So limited to those with lots of money, typically. Now, if you go forward a bit, so now we're into the late 1800s, there were companies. That picture on the left there is actually the Matthews Boat Company in the earliest years. More on that in a minute. But you had people that started to think about making boats more high volume so the ordinary folks could buy them, but they were designed properly by a shipwright. So now we're getting into the early 20th century, the gasoline engines coming along, and the classic power boats are coming on real strong. So you have boats like these beautiful mahogany boats, and the boat design tended to track horsepower. So the faster the boats went, they had the bigger engines in them. And I looked back and found in 1885 that the first gasoline marine engine was credited to Gottlieb Daimler, German, like my wife, and his friend Mahlbach. If any of you know about cars, the Mahlbach company, they still make trucks and so forth, but a German company. So these two guys got together back in the day using probably the wife's greenhouse in the backyard, and they developed the engine together and got the patent. It had a whopping half horsepower. Go forward a bit, 1931, to our area, there's been a lot of progress. The Kermoth Manufacturing Company in Detroit made some very nice engines, top-notch engineering. They were used in Matthews, also in some other boats, Chris Craft, Garwood, and some others. This one, the picture you see is a 6-cylinder, 225 horse engine. They went up to 12 cylinders. So with the faster boats like this, along came a new sport, water skiing. You have to have a powerful boat to do this. I got these pictures from the CIC archives, about 1931. You can see some of the folks out doing some primitive water skiing. And you can see in the background the club. And then the top right one, you see the bluffs in the background. Oh, pretty neat. Now, the wooden boat, the vintage wooden boat topic is also enormous. I couldn't believe what I found. The Antique and Classic Boat Society is one group of folks. They know so far of 1,166 manufacturers of classic boats that have existed or still exist. So you have companies, for example, like Hackercraft, if you know what that company is. They were at the boat show 2 years ago, and they had a beautiful runabout. They still make wooden boats that look just like back in the 30s. And I think there's a few others. So, back 100 years ago, there were some beautiful wooden boats going all around the island that people owned. This picture is from the CIC archives, and it shows clearly 3 of these boats. Off they go. On the right are the bluffs. You see the club in the background, the old bathhouse. I don't think the hotel was built yet, so it was probably early or the late 1920s. So you had names like Lyman, Matthews, Chris Craft, Dart, Garwood, Trojan, Stanley, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of boats the names were familiar to people in this area that were engaged in water sports. I put a few pictures in here of some of them. And keep in mind, these are just runabouts. I mean, these companies often made a whole line of boats from runabouts up to large cruisers. But these are just a few. Just, to me, it's like a piece of furniture floating in the lake. They're just beautiful, beautifully made boats. I think that's an Elco, larger boat. This promotional booklet we got from the club recently, it's from 1930, roughly. And just to show that the club, way back then, was already promoting powerboats. If you go to page 5, you find this little heading here. It's Speedboat Mecca. And at the bottom left, there's a paragraph that says, J.G. Robinson, editor of Powerboating, claims our boat basin in these islands will make this area the greatest powerboat section in the U.S. in a few years. It has long been known as the Yachtsman's Paradise. So they were going after that designation. I'll talk a little bit here about speedboat racing around the island. It was very popular at one time. We just acquired this original 1929 Cliffs plat map. How many live in the Cliffs? So if you come by the museum, maybe not this summer, I'm going to see what I can do, but this is about 2 feet by 2 feet. It's folded up. It's almost like a leather material, and it has all of the lots listed on here, ones that were sold and not sold. But the man that developed the Cliffs was Bellows, and Joshua Bellows. And at the bottom right corner, you see a little, heading there, Catawba Cliffs on Lake Erie, finest speedboating. So he was already trying to get the customers that had boats. This picture is from the club. It had a title on the photo, Speedboat Race Begins. And you see 3 of them, off they go. On the left, I believe that's the bluffs. And there were actually endurance races around the island. So you had this floating barge thing out there. Some of you may recognize the bathhouse when it was finished there. Next to that used to be the I think it was called the Log Cabin Restaurant. And they used to serve chicken dinners there. So if you had a speedboat and you were in an endurance race, you could pull up to this raft and you could, fill up without going back into the marina. Also, there were invitational races going on between clubs. So this letter we got from the club here came from Klinger Lake Boat Club up in Sturgis, Michigan. They still have a club up there, and they would invite each other to these events. So this one is talking about invitational race. Let's see. Outboard motor races on the afternoon of July 6th. There were $100 cash prizes, and we'll be glad to have you tell your boating friends as we expect a big crowd anxious to have good races. So, a lot of racing going on. I'll end about racing with this more recent story, kind of a fun fact. This fellow here was a very successful racer, speedboat racer, Bill Munsey. This story I got from Jim Stouffer. Thanks, Jim. And this fellow had a connection to the club. The family owned Chevy dealership up in Detroit. So he had access to some very powerful engines. And he was also a very good racer. His folks had a place in the Cliffs. His brother Ray did not race, but apparently they bought the property that is now the South Marina, and they were working on doing things with speedboats down there. And eventually the club got it. So that's a little backstory on the South Marina. You know why it's separated, I guess. All right, now if you're in the Yachtsman Association, I don't want you to be disappointed at this point because we're not going to talk much about the harbor out here. That's going to be later. I'm working on this display. We're going to have a special exhibit coming in August, and I'm going to focus on the harbor marina. We're going to focus on the yachtsmen and their events because that's a long history too. And so, any of you in the association, if you have any artifacts, photos, anything at all that you don't have to give us the photos. I can scan them and give them right back to you. But I'd like to have some personal touches, like here's Uncle Fred with his 1941 Matthews, parked in the harbor here at the club, and then that can go into the display. So spread the word. Now, of course, where's Marcia? Thank you, Marcia. Marcia Springer. Does anybody know Alan Marcia Springer? Right? Yeah. So this is a picture that Marcia shared with me, and I think it's fabulous because it shows a 1954 Chris Craft off of Sand Beach over by Davis Bessie, and Marcia and two of her three sisters. And this to me just typifies a much more relaxed way of living back in those days. They had no way to communicate with the shore. Marcia tells me that the sisters would often, or not often, but sometimes go from Toledo to the cottage by themselves and back, especially at the end of the season. And they would go out to West Sister, they'd drop anchor, go swimming, walk around the island. And I said, well, what about if there was a storm came up, and well, we were told that this design of a boat would not capsize, so we were safe. And she said there were some white knuckle trips out in the lake with the sisters, who I think were teenagers at the time, right? Yeah. And before this, they had, the best part is they had, a 13 and an 18-foot Lyman. And then along came water skiing. So they said, Dad, we need a more powerful boat to water ski. So kind of twisted his arm to get this beautiful Chris Craft cruiser. And I presume it was good for water skiing. So that's that story. All right, so high volume production of pleasure boats. I'm going to just finish the power boat section with two legends that are local. We all know about them, Matthews and Lyman. Amazing histories. The Matthews Boat Company was down on the Portage River, and it was just west of downtown Port Clinton. This was in its prime. It was a big piece of property. I'm going to have some pictures of some of the yachts in the background on these slides so you can see what they look like. Not sure of the names on all of them. We'll start with, here's Mr. Scott Matthews. By all accounts, he was a man of vision. He had a passion for excellence. He was a savvy businessman. He navigated the company through 80 years of up and down, depression, everything else, kept the company going. And he was very innovative. He was kind of an inventor, as you'll see. In 1890, he started the company at age 16 in Bascom, Ohio. And I think his dad pretty quickly said, let's move to the sawmill, shall we? So that's a picture of the sawmill that his dad owned. And they were building boats there. And they would move the boats from the sawmill. And if you don't know where Bascom is, it's right here between Tiffin and Fostoria. So not a likely place to start a yacht company. In the beginning, and so 1898, Matthews and shipped these boats, a 16-foot launch, a 45-foot cruiser, to the Lausier Motor Company in Plattsburgh, New York. And then the Plattsburgh, or the Lausier Company, they put their name on the boats, which he agreed to. But the relationship ended about the time Lausier moved into automobiles. Some of the really nice boats that came out of the Bascom facility, one was the Standard. It was the first Gold Cup race winner, which was a big deal. And the one that I like is the story of the Onward. Some of you may have heard Bob Reynolds talk on the. Bob Reynolds is one of the grandsons of Matthews, and he told the story. They built this beautiful boat, 9,000-mile trip down the Mississippi, into the Gulf, around Florida, up the Atlantic, and then back home again. And this boat was outfitted with all the latest technology, and quite an adventure. So now we're getting into the era here. In 1906, he moved the company to Port Clinton, and he named it the Matthews Boat Company. Now he had access to deeper water, so he could start to focus on big boats, getting them to his customers, mostly on the East Coast. They were usually wealthy people. So in this era, here's 1910, he was building boats now mostly for very wealthy clients. That was his focus. He also built boats for the military. The 85-foot Mahapa was built for a fellow in Cleveland. He built a 50-foot cruiser for Charles Ringling Brothers Circus fame, down in Sarasota. He built the Detroit 35-foot boat. They said it looked like a lifeboat, and for a guy named I can't think of his name. They put a very small engine in this boat. He went and he ended up with the smallest gasoline-powered vessel to cross the Atlantic, and this boat actually made it to St. Petersburg, Russia, and safely. I can't think of his name. He built gasoline engines up in Detroit. I can't remember the guy's name. Huh? Scripps, yeah, Scripps, thank you. So he had that done. This, I can't really pronounce this name, but this is a 110-foot 1913 yacht. It became the first all-American diesel yacht and the largest pleasure boat that they would ever build. 1914, the 100-foot Merolde was built, America's most powerful yacht, 900 horsepower, 30-knot top speed. And around 1915, Mr. Matthews couldn't find any good electrical vendors. He wanted to start to get electricity in the boats, and so he developed his own capstan, lighting, power plant, the whole business. And 1916, he changed the name to the Matthews Company, because the economy was already going up and down, and he wanted to keep his guys working. They started making these sub-chasers, 110-foot sub-chasers. He even built a large warehouse to house these things in. This is a picture from Portage River. You can see 6 of them being worked on. And in the background is I think the facility that they put them in. So when the economy would slow down, he'd have his guys making things like towel racks and meat cutters and phonograph cabinets. In 1919, a 60-foot Whitecap. Work was slowing down again, so he invented this farm lighting system, car tire change, anything to keep the place running. In 22, the 95-foot Oswiecki was built for a private party. He also built a 50-foot passenger boat for an amusement park and some federal speedboats to chase rum runners. And some of them ended up in the hands of the rum runners. So around 1924, it looks like there was a big change in the business model. And he wanted to keep the guys working in volatile markets. He also, some think he was influenced by Henry Ford, mass production techniques. And so he decided to switch over to mass-produced boats, basically standardized stock boats. And was the first in the industry I have read. So he started out with a 38-foot Special. In 1925, the 99-foot Irwin was the last custom-built yacht that the company made. Beyond that, they were into volume production. They committed. So there were 3 new standard offerings. There's a 46-foot boat, a 1928 32-foot speed cruiser, and then this 34-foot sailboat in 1932. In 1942, 36-foot and a 38-foot landing crafts were being built for the military. Here's some pictures. Being tested on Lake Erie, I guess. And I just found this article in a publication called the Nabagon. And we have several of these in the museum that were being issued by the club to the earliest members. And there's some great stories in there. This one was dedicated to Mr. Matthews. And it talked about his life, his business, his involvement with the club. I guess he was an avid golfer. So about the article, they were talking about what a great golfer and friend he was. In 1950, they had their 60th anniversary. In 51, the first modern double cabin design was launched. And in 1956, Mr. Matthews passed away and his son Carl became president. And in 62, we had the first flush deck double cabin design. And then in 64, the kids, the two sons, the two daughters cashed out. They sold the company to Charles Hutchinson, and he contracted with Halmatic out of England, which is still a company. They're, I guess, a very good shipbuilding company on the coast. And they were building 46-foot fiberglass hulls for Matthews, shipping them to Ohio, and then they'd finish the boats there. So in 1971, they developed their own way of making fiberglass hulls. It was called the world's largest rotating mold. And they were making a 56-foot Matthews that they would then outfit in different ways depending on the customer. And in 75, they went out of business, unfortunately. So we'll take a quick look here at Lyman, another legend. Quite a story. You can see that the Lyman facility was here, just a little bit east of Sandusky. This is a safe statement, I would say. They produce unique, superbly crafted lapstrake pleasure boats that many enthusiasts still own, maintain, and enjoy in the waters around Catawba Island. So the timeline goes like this. 1861, Ernst and his wife and two sons came from Prussia, settled in Cleveland. The boys became cabinet makers. Bernard started fiddling with boats at a young age. He made a 15-foot sailing skiff, and he really enjoyed it. It was based on the ancient lapstrake method that the Vikings used. The boat's allowed to twist a little bit, which gives it a nice ride in the lake. In 1875, he enjoyed it so much, he decided just to stop being a cabinet maker and start making boats full time. Retired in 1878. He kept and his son William took over. And William kept the traditional construction techniques. And then that attracted a lot of the loyal folks that we know, hunters, fishermen, just ordinary people that want a really well-made boat for Lake Erie. In the 1930s, William instituted very strict guidelines that applied to all the boats, and that helped to keep them in business, kept the cost to a minimum. This is their factory, their new factory, 1937. Now, World War II, from what I've read, provided an epiphany for the company. The government wanted 5 different personnel carriers, and they wanted them fast. So William got his best woodworkers together and made these very precise jigs, upside down, excuse me. And then the other workers could build the boats on top of the jigs and speed the process up. The other epiphany was that the government said, use this wood instead of hardwood. So they used this marine grade plywood, they cut it into strips, and they used that on the outside of the hull. It ended up fitting better. This wood's more stable, so it doesn't expand and contract. And Lyman continued that into the post-war era, which gave them a big advantage if hardwood was hard to find. So after the war, the inboard motors, which are basically automobile engines, were getting hard to find. So William wisely chose to continue making outboard boats mostly. And his idea was, we'll mass produce these, ship them to the dealers all over the place, and let the dealerships worry about getting the outboard engines. If somebody wanted an inboard model, they would still build them, but it depended on if they could get the larger engines. So now we're up to about 1951. They're almost at peak levels. They were building hulls, outboard hulls, every 35 minutes. Inboard hulls took a little bit longer, a few hours. And when he passed away, his son-in-law took over, Fred, I think that's pronounced Wine. And then about this time, too, the Chris Craft Company was nipping at their heels. They developed their sea skiff division. So Lyman responded by just making bigger boats, longer boats with more bells and whistles. I took this picture a few years ago at Gem Beach, just a beautiful Lyman. So competition kept growing. They offered this 30-foot sedan. They also built the Sportsman with open design. And in '73, they stopped making wooden hulls. And I think they gave fiberglass a try, but they ended up closing in 1980. We just acquired this instrument panel. It's nothing, real elaborate, but what's cool about this is that I called up, anybody know who Tom Korokne is? They call him the Lyman Doctor. And he apparently purchased all the jigs and all the stuff to do with building these boats. And I called him up and I showed him a picture and he said, that looks to me like a 1980. And so I did some more research and it comes from a 1980 Lyman glass 26-foot. It was the last year that Lyman made boats, so we have that in the museum. Okay, let's go to sailing. A friend of mine in the audience here has been in sailing for many years, and I don't know a whole lot about sailing, so I interviewed him at home and learned a lot. And one of the first things Roger said was, when 2 or more sailboats get together, there's going to be a race. And then we went from there. So prior to about the middle of the 20th century, yachting in a sailboat was also pretty much for the wealthy, right? And same process. You get a very good shipwright, you design a beautiful yacht. It was unique, it was one of a kind, using the same process. And then, you might get together with your friends and make a wager that my boat's faster. And next thing you know, you've got the America's Cup. And this event was, the epicenter in the beginning was on the East Coast. And they would race for the coveted Ewer Cup. It's the oldest continuous international sport on the planet. So now what do? You're an ordinary guy, you want to race a sailboat, but you can't afford a big yacht. So the first concept that came along that helped us was called the one design sailing concept. Here you had contender boats. They were identical or similar in design, and they raced in fleets. A group of them would race. They'd all start at the same time. These were class legal boats. They raced each other without handicap calculations, and the winner was the first to finish, right? This concept really took off, and one of the pioneers was a guy named William Crosby. 1931, he designed the Snipe, and this boat became very popular. One of the most popular sailing dinghies ever made, and it's still raced all over the world. So with this design came a lot of interest, and it really took off after World War II. Lots of companies making these smaller sailboats. Right now, there's more than 200 actively raced categories. There are fleets that operate usually out of yacht clubs, but other venues. Crews all over the country on a regular basis. If you can get a crew, and it provides, the thrill of racing just for ordinary folks. When Rita and I were younger, we did a little bit of that with some friends that asked us to be on their boat with them. A lot of fun. Now, as time went by, there was a problem. Here's the same guy. Now he's got a bigger boat. but he still wants to race, right? And so a lot of these manufacturers came along, were very popular. These are just some of them: Douglas and McLeod, Tartan, CNC, Hinckley, O'Day, making bigger, nicely made fiberglass boats. The problem was these boats are all a little different, so they couldn't really compete with each other by all starting at the same time. So they came up with a handicap system. The acronym is PERF, it's Performance Handicap Racing Fleet, in the 1980s. And I'm told that racing these boats is very complicated. You know, you have to look at things like not only the hull design, the shape, the length. You've got the sails have different square footage. There's pockets. There's all kinds of calculations that have to be made, and it's not just put the sail up and race. So, and there may be people out here that can expound on that. But that pretty much leveled the playing field. I think we were doing that with our friends because we would all start at different times and go around markers. It was a lot of fun. Okay, here's just a little bit on racing history around here. Here's a club in 1983. Now, here in CIC, at the Catawba Cliffs Beach Club and the CIC, they never really embraced fleet racing, my understanding. But they always welcomed sailboats. So you can see here, lots of sailboats. And there still are races here, inter-club races. I think there's 5 different ones a year, I'm told, but never fleets per se. So still have some beautiful sailboats here at the club. And each year, there are some very big regattas. So we'll take a little look at that. I've got a few. The biggest, of course, being the Mills Race. That goes way back. It's the premier sailboat race for larger vessels in the western basin here of Lake Erie. They go right past us. 1865, in Toledo, 2 rowing clubs got together to form the Toledo Yacht Club, one of the oldest in America. And they built this beautiful clubhouse. Look at that thing. Burned down 3 years later. Yeah, so very, very sad. So as kind of a supportive gesture, the Commodore Merrill Mills donated this silver punch bowl, and he said, "We're going to start a race. We're going to get back up on our feet." So he said, "It's for the purpose of encouraging proficiency in the art of navigation upon the Great Lakes by means of popular contests in yachting," and that started the Mills Race. So in 1907, the first Mills Race occurred, and it began a tradition that's still with us all these years. The original course started at the Yacht Club, went past the Detroit River, circled the Cleveland Crib Lights, and ended at Put-in Bay. And I'm told it occurred at night to test can you imagine without the modern, equipment to be sailing during the night and you have to get to your destination. This is President Taft. I guess he was a big sailing aficionado, and he Libby Grass, last president and commodore of the club at that time, this Richardson, asked Taft to commission a trophy for a smaller class of boat to race also. It's called the President's Trophy. And that was given to the Possum, the first boat to win that race. This is the Mills course. There are 3 different courses, so you see where it went. This, I believe, is the longest one, and I hope I have the distances correct. They began about 1.5 miles from the harbor light and went about 78 miles to get to the finish. They go right past us, right where the circle is. This is the governor's course, a little shorter, similar path, and this is the president's course, the shortest. And if I have the distances wrong, just correct me at the end. I think those are right. They all finish at Put-in Bay. In the Mills course, the Mills Trophy and the President's Cup are the ones that everyone wants to win. All right. We'll finish up here. Sandusky Island Race is another one. It's a destination regatta. It goes from Sandusky Bay to Millbass Island. Decent number of boats every year. Started in the 1950s. Another is the Green Island Race. Small race. They go out of the Port Clinton Yacht Club around nearby Green Island. just a short introduction to that. And then this one I find fascinating. Roger knows a guy that does this every year. Erie Solo Challenge. This is crazy. 312 statute miles by yourself. So they start at the North Cape Yacht Club near Monroe here. They go by Pelee Island, straight across all the way to Buffalo, around the Shoal Light near Buffalo, and then back to Presque Isle. And you're doing it by yourself. So, of course, the challenges with this are no sleep, weather, lake conditions, boats, freighters, all that kind of stuff. Roger told me that his friend will set a course and maybe sleep for 15 minutes, to try to get a little bit of rest, get a cat nap. So my hat's off if anybody can do that.
How long?
How long? Oh, that I don't know. Roger, how many hours? Any idea? I don't know. Other than it's very long. I don't know. Okay, here's a last look here. Pleasure boating and rum running, all right? This is pretty interesting. This is actually a picture from Port Clinton somewhere. They're dumping liquor near the lake. Now, most of you know about the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. Really stupid law. Really, let's face it. There were only two laws ever repealed in American history. This was one of them, and slavery was the other one. So it was called Prohibition, and it was started by
And they gave them the right to vote.
the law said the prohibition of manufacture, transport, and sale of liquor for personal consumption. That was the idea. It was supposed to ameliorate poverty and solve some other societal problems. What actually happened is it caused an explosion of organized crime, loss of respect for law enforcement, corruption of the politicians, police, and courts, and drastic changes in women's conduct and behavior. And they launched a template for extreme political activism. We still see, and to this day, a lot of the stuff going on, you can actually trace way back to that era. And there were ladies going in saloons with hatchets, and they were chopping things up, and it was bad. The Women's Saloon League, I think, was a. So Americans, like we do, we start pushing back, and speakeasies popped up all over the place, and people said, "Screw you!" And they were. So in order to of course, to get the liquor, you had to move it around, and that's where the bootleggers came in, the rum runners. They kept the supply lines open. Rural areas like here were also well supplied. Don used to tell me that back in the 1920s, we had the top of the island looked nothing like it does now. We had hotels, we had dance halls, bowling alleys. It was really the place to be in the summer. Screened-in dance halls, dance marathons. And so Don said, these places all had liquor. And because we were so far north of the main road, he said we could get away with things a little easier. It was harder to do a raid this far up. So if you wanted liquor for a family function, they put it in a tree, a boot, whatever. Marcia told me that their family cottage over on Sand Beach that they bought, the parents found there was a hiding place in the wall for liquor. So they come across the lake and, So we became a super highway. And these guys, a lot of them used heavily modified pleasure boats. I'm going to highlight one of them. This is a Dart out of Toledo, just to give you an idea how big they were. Okay, anybody know about John Setzer? This is a pretty cool story. This guy was a local rum runner, one of the more well-known ones. He and his brother, I want to say, had a pleasure boat business on the Portage River. And right around 1925, he decided to start a new side business, like a lot of people did. So he decided to start running rum or liquor, and his brother Joe, and he owned this Port Clinton Marine on the Portage River. So they had a nice setup. He could come across Lake Erie with a boatload of liquor, go under his business, and get the boat lifted out of the water just like that. It would disappear. He also liked speed, apparently. So He first ordered up an all-teak 75-foot dart from Toledo. Looked kind of like this. What'd I say? Oh, I'm sorry, 27. Like this. He put in two 500 horsepower engines, is what I've read. So he claimed he could reach Leamington, Ontario in 17 minutes. And so that meshes with his son. My dad loves speed, so off he went. And there's another fun story about that. He also had a 38-foot Matthews cruiser, which was more of a workboat. 300 cases of liquor would fit in that boat. So I guess when the coast was clear, he would take that out. He also had a 33-foot Baby Gar with a 500 horsepower Liberty airplane engine. And the cops said one time they clocked him at 62 miles an hour. There's the engine. So he also had a plane. So what he would do is pick up a shipment with his plane, deliver it to the customer who would put flashlights in the ground pointing up, 2 of them. So he could look down and people on the ground couldn't see the lights, but he could see 2 lights. He knew kind of where the runway was. He'd drop the plane down, unload the cargo, take off. He got into trouble finally with this guy. Alvin Karpus was a criminal that was on, the top 1 or 2 most wanted criminal list. He didn't know that. He claims he didn't know that. He and this Ma Barker and some other criminals did a $34,000 train heist, and they went to Port Clinton and they dumped all their extra junk and got rid of it. And he was captured eventually, but he commissioned Setzer to fly him to Hot Springs, Arkansas, which he did, and that's where the arrests occurred apparently. So once Setzer got out of prison, he said, "I'd do it all over again," because the law was unconstitutional. It was stupid. What it was a stupid law. And I'll finish with this picture. I just was given to this by one of our board members. Her uncle is in here somewhere. I think it's her uncle. These are ordinary people. These guys were rum runners. You had fishermen, you had people that wanted to make some extra money. And so they would, don't they look like hardened criminals? So you had commercial fishermen. They would fill their boats up with liquor. They called it midnight herring. And they'd go across the lake. There was a lot of activity east of here. I want to say from Canada down to maybe Port Huron, and some of them with the bags over the side of the boat, and they would move along. And if they saw the cops coming, they would chop the roads, drop the cargo, and they would be okay. So there you are. That's a little bit on rum running. I'm done. Thanks for coming. What time is it? Wow, exactly an hour. Anyway, thanks for listening. That was a lot of stuff, I know. I tried to shorten it, but
Excellent.
Craig talked me into doing it. Anybody have any questions?
I can't believe the time you put into that, really.
I can't either. Thanks. It's fun. I enjoy it. Anybody learn anything? Yeah, isn't that cool? So we have all of this in the museum in more detail if you want to stop by and read. And then we're going to do the one on the club marina. So that's all I have.